Hey, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to There's Hope Ministries. We're so thankful again that you would choose to take this time to view this message video from our ministry, online ministry, There's Hope. And again, we're thankful for each one that has viewed each video over the last few weeks, made comments, and also have shared those videos. I certainly appreciate that. And I want to wish everyone a happy Independence Day. I know this is Sunday, but I hope you had a good day yesterday with family and were able to get together and enjoy some things safely and just enjoy the freedoms and the liberties that we have. And I hope we have taken time to be appreciative for the freedoms, but also for those who have given their lives and fought for the freedoms and liberties that we enjoy. And I certainly hope you've taken time to do that yesterday, but even today on the Lord's Day, as you're visiting your home church and worshiping with your group of people there, your congregation. I'd like for you to take the Word of God, please. Look at the Old Testament in Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, chapter 8. In light of Independence Day weekend and our country and our nation, and just again being able to celebrate and enjoy all that God has provided for us. I hope we never forget that. Certainly the great men and women who have died to secure and to protect our liberties, but let's make sure we thank God that we have this country that we have. And I want to look a little bit about that today. I hope that the message will bring us to a place where we can reflect on that. We look at an example in the life of the nation of Israel back in Deuteronomy chapter 8. And let's begin reading. I'll read a few verses. We'll begin with verse number 7, but we'll use all the way down to verse 20 through the lesson in this chapter today. But let's read just a few verses, beginning with verse 7, Deuteronomy 8 and verse 7. It says, "For the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive, and honey, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness, thou shalt not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills thou mayest dig brass. When thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee." Notice verse 11. It says, "Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command thee this day." Verse 12 says, "Lest when thou hast eaten and are full and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied," verse 14 says, "then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage." Again, we see here in the nation of Israel, the life of Israel, and what here is commanded of them. Moses is delivering this command, certainly from God, that they would remember God's past dealings. The warning here is not to forget. And I'd like to be able to take this passage of Scripture, if I could today, and we can look at and examine some things in the life of the children of Israel. They're right on the brink of entering into Canaan. And just to think about how God had blessed them, how God had provided for them, how God had protected them, how God had defended them. And again, I'd really like to try to make an application today in relation to our country and we as the United States of America, we as God's people in this country. First of all, we say the ability to forget is often a blessing. As we think about things maybe we're going through in our life that hopefully with time maybe again bad things or things that have happened to things we've gone through that in time, we might be able to forget things. So often the ability to forget is often looked upon as a blessing. But here we find the Israelites were warned repeatedly about the danger of forgetting the essential things. As the nation of Israel stood poised to enter into Canaan, and Moses is about ready, as we know here towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy, he'll pass off the scene, he'll pass away, and leadership will be turned over to Joshua, and of course the title character of the next book to follow the book of Deuteronomy. But we find here that Moses reviews God's mighty works and previewed the blessings that awaited them in Canaan. But because Moses knew the people that God had called him to lead, he knew that their potential for straying, and he warned them not to forget the provisions that God had made. Again, notice in verse 11, he says, beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command thee this day. So three things just real quick I want to look at this morning. I hope we can make a comparison to us in our country today, and again what we're going through, and the title of the message this morning I've entitled this: Is there hope for America? Is there hope for America? And hopefully we can answer that question. Again, I think just in a general sense we'd have to say yes, there's hope for America, because I certainly believe that revival is possible for our country and for our people. But we have to understand that I believe as long as there is God, or God is real, God is alive, which we know He is, there's always hope. There's hope for individuals. We may say of someone that say, well, they've really gone off the deep end, or they've strayed, or they've fallen away from God. There's no hope. There's always hope as long as there is God, and God always has been, He always will be. So we understand in the general sense, we answer that question: is there hope for America? I say excitedly, yes, there's hope for America. But I want to look at some things today. Here we see, first of all, in relation to scriptures that we'll read in the life of the nation of Israel, we'll see that, first of all, there's a reminder of God's blessings in Canaan. And we see that beginning in verse 7 through verse 10. Let's look at those verses again. It says, for the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks, of waters, of fountains, and depths that spring out of valleys and hills. Notice again the description here that would be provided in this land for God's people. It says, verse 8, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive, and honey. Verse 9 says, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness, thou shalt not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills thou mayest dig brass. Verse 10 says, when thou hast eaten and are full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which He hath given thee. Notice, first of all, a reminder of God's blessings in Canaan. That the first thing that Moses wanted to remind them of was God's provision. We see that in verse 7 through 9, in his exhortation to this new generation of Israelites, Moses urged them to remember the faithfulness of the Lord as He led them through the desert. Certainly we know they were turned away to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and Moses, again, to this new generation of Israelites, he urged them to remember how faithful the Lord has been. Israel is about to enter Canaan, where more abundant blessings awaited its people. As description here again in those verses, it was a good land, a land of brooks of waters, of fountains, and depths that spring out of the valleys. There in verse 7, water we know was essential to life, and in the land that had any land that had a good supply was certainly a blessed land if it had water. Such a land produced grains, as it says there in verse 8, it produced grains such as wheat and barley. when cultivated, became the main source of flour and bread for these people. Canaan was also land. Notice the description. There are vines and fig trees and pomegranates and oil olive and honey. Just some of the description of that. We understand grapevines were most common plants in ancient times, and they were renowned for their size. We know that when the spies were sent in to spy out the land or canvass the land, they came back with clusters of grapes that were just amazing, just as a sign of what was in the land. So we find here it also talks about pomegranates. Pomegranates resembled an apple. We find that were valued for its juice. It says oil olive, referred to the olive trees for which olive was obtained. We know olive oil was valuable for food as well as a source of oil. This oil could be used for both cooking but also medicinal purposes. Honey was a term often referred to figuratively. When it talked about honey, it talked about fertility or abundance in the land, but it also referred to in the literal sense, as is no doubt here, honey made of bees from nectars of flowers, and but also a thick syrup from grapes and dates. But we find that Israel's prosperity would not only come through its agricultural products, but also through its mineral resources. Look down to verse number 9. It says, "A land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness, thou shalt not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills thou mayest dig brass." So not only agriculturally it was a great land, but also because of its mineral resources there in verse number 9. So we see a reminder of God's provision, what not only the blessings that they had in the past, how God provided for them, even in those 40 years of wilderness wanderings, but also what would yet to come would be a great provision from God. So he wanted to remind them of that, but also he wanted to remind them of Israel's responsibility. Look at verse 10. It says, "When thou hast eaten and art full, when thou hast blessed the Lord thy God for the good," it says, "When thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee." So we find that there's a reminder of God's blessings in Canaan, first of all, for God's provision, but also a reminder here of Israel's responsibility. Not only it was logical that if God provided abundant resources for Israel's prosperity, that the nation would certainly, as it says there in verse 10, bless the Lord. And I think about that in relation to our country just quickly. We have a great land. We have a prosperous land. We have a agriculture. I can't even begin to think about all the blessings that this land provides us and the people who dwell in this country. And we have to be reminded, just I think as this is given here as a reminder of how God provides for us, but also we need to be reminded as God's people of our responsibility. And certainly we would think about how God has blessed this country, how God has provided for this country, how God has called and set up men and women in position at various times throughout our history to carve this country out to be what he intended for it to be for the dwellers of this land, that we certainly ought to be thankful, as it says there in verse 10, that then we should bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he has given us. Just like in the case of Israel, we first find there that as Moses wanted to give the children of Israel a reminder, so also I think it ought to stand out to us that we be reminded of God's blessings in this land that he has given us. Notice secondly, we find that there's a caution. The caution is about forgetting God's blessings. Look at verse 11. It says, "Beware lest thou forget not the Lord thy God in not keeping his commandments and judgments and statutes which I command thee this day, lest when thou hast eaten or are full and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thine heart be lifted up, that thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage." We'll stop right there. First of all, we see a caution First of all, the reminder of God's blessings in the land, but also a caution about forgetting God's blessing. So we find here that the caution, first of all, not only did Moses command thankfulness, certainly it says in there at the close of verse 10 that thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee. Certainly ought to be thankful for that, just as we ought to be thankful for all that God has given us in our country, the United States of America. But not only did Moses command them to be thankful, but he also warned of the real possibility that God's people might forget the Lord. He says there in verse 11, beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God. So there's a warning here, a caution that there's the real possibility that he was telling them before they entered land that you would forget God when you come to this place of with all the mineral resources, all the agricultural and the cattle and the goats and all the flocks and the herds and everything begins to multiply. That there's the caution was given that they might forget God, and of course we know from Israel's history they did. And certainly that ought to stand out to us in relation to our country and the lives that we can enjoy here in the United States. Whenever we lose sight of God's presence, we no longer consider Him real. When we lose sight of God's presence, just as Israel did here, He said, beware lest thou forget the Lord. We lose sight of God's presence. We no longer consider Him real. To us, He does not seem to be related in everyday affairs of life. When He seems to be far off and the keeping of His commandments becomes less urgent. And that's what we find here. He says, beware lest thou forget not the Lord thy God. Notice, in keeping of His commandments, His judgments, His statutes, which I command thee. Again, I say this, that when we lose sight of the presence of God, we no longer consider Him real. And when we lose sight of the presence of God, when He seems so far away and He does not seem to relate to us in everyday life, the keeping of His commandments becomes less urgent. And this was the danger that prospering Israel would encounter. So we see a caution. Secondly, under this point here about forgetting God's blessing, notice the stumbling blocks. Look at verse 12. It says, then lest when thou hast eaten or are full, and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied. Notice verse 14, then thine heart be lifted up, that thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Notice here the stumbling blocks that they would face. Moses told the people how they would be tempted to forget God, and as a result, they would disobey His commands. They would be tempted to forget God. While traveling in the desert, we understand that 40 years of wandering through the wilderness, they were forced to depend upon God for daily bread, which in that case was manna, and also they were forced to depend upon God for water. They were traveling in the wilderness. God brought them to that place that they would learn to trust in Him for what they need. In that case, He provided daily for manna. He provided when they needed it, when they were in need of water. We understand that they were not permitted to hoard manna for future use. They were only gathered what they would need for their families for that day, with the exception of the day before the Sabbath. You could gather enough to get you through the Sabbath, and we understand that wherever they went, they had only portable tents to live, and they were continually packing everything up and wandering and moving on, and then they would be shown the sign to stop and rest here for a while, and they'd be there for a particular amount of time, and then they'd pack up everything and they would move on. They were just continually wandering in the wilderness, as we understand. But here we find that all this was about to change. And this is what Moses was telling them, that you're going from a place where you had to depend upon God, which is a good place, that we understand we must depend upon God, as the children of Israel did during that time of wandering. And all this was now about to change. Shortly they would eat the produce of Canaan. They'd plant and harvest crops of their own. They would be given tribal and family allotments of land and would build houses. Their lives would become more settled and would be able to follow a more predictable and stable schedule or lifestyle. We find everything's about to change. And Moses warned of the day that when Israel, because of riches, notice it says there in verse number 12, lest when thou hast eaten and are full, and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, that in verse 14, then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God. Everything was about to change. They were going from having to depend and trust upon God to a place where there's going to be so much prosperity that God provided for them, that God made possible for them in this land, that there'd be so much that Moses felt the need to warn them and caution them and remind them of some stumbling blocks that would possibly stand in the way that would cause them to forget God. And we find that he said that thine heart be lifted up and thou forget the Lord thy God. We understand here what Moses was saying and how it's fitting to us today, that prosperity and possessions and plenty would bring pride, and pride would erase God from their memory. Again, prosperity and possessions and plenty would bring pride. It says there in verse 14, then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God. We understand that in times of prosperity, that spiritual realities are often crowded out. And certainly, again, can we apply this to this great land that we live in? The prosperity of the United States. And again, let's reflect back here a little bit, that even in our recent days under our president, that we have experienced job growth, we've experienced great prosperity, everything is booming. Let us be careful to take the reminder as well of the potential stumbling blocks, that our heart be lifted up with pride, that we forget God. And now, look, we have been brought to a crash, if you would, in economics and income and jobs, economy, everything we're facing, how humbling it can be in just a moment. And we understand, again, that God is in control of everything. I hope you believe that today, that God is in control today. God is in control tomorrow. He was in control before this pandemic revealed itself. He was in control, and He was behind all the prosperity. We need to be reminded of that. We cannot be looking to a man or a party, political party, or anything else as to why we are so blessed in this country. We are blessed in this country because of God, and we need to take the warning and the caution and be reminded of some stumbling blocks that might stand in the way that cause us to forget God, just like Israel did. But notice this last thing here under the second point, the blessings forgotten. There's a caution about forgetting God's blessings, the caution, the stumbling blocks that stand in the way, and notice the blessings forgotten. Look at verse 14 again. It says, then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth. Notice, brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. The blessings be forgotten. Verse 15, who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water, who brought thee forth water out of a rock of flint. Verse 16 says, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, which he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee to do thee good at thy latter end. Verse 17 says, and thou shalt say in thine heart, my power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth. Here's the caution again. The caution, we find the stumbling blocks, we find the blessings forgotten. The tragedy of spiritual forgetfulness was that it dismissed and belittled the many mercies that God had already bestowed upon Israel. Let me say that again. The tragedy of spiritual forgetfulness was that it dismissed and belittled many of the mercies that God had already bestowed upon them. Everything that God had brought them through, even far back to when he delivered them out of the hands of the Egyptians when they were oppressed by the cruel taskmasters, that God delivered them from that. What a great blessing that they were cautioned, don't forget that. He had redeemed them. He'd purchased them. He bought them. He brought them out of bondage and out of slavery. We find here that without his intervention, they would still be slaves. They'd still be slaves without God's work. They'd still be slaves. This God, who they were in danger of forgetting, was the God who had led them through that great and terrible wilderness, as described in these verses, a place of drought where there was no water, but where God supplied water out of a rock of flint, as it says in verse 15, and continued to display his mercy by feeding them with manna, which their fathers knew not, in verse 16. Yes, they complained about it, so all we have is this manna. They remembered back in Egypt when they had the fish and the leeks and the melons and the cucumbers and the garlic. I think it's described in Numbers chapter 11, I believe it is. And they remembered that, what they had back there, but God had miraculously supplied for them in the wilderness, it says, to humble them. To humble them. And what did they remember? What they thought was good back in Egypt, even though they forgot that we were slaves. We were under the hand of cruel taskmasters, and God delivered them from that and brought them in, is bringing them into a great and prosperous land. I think about that in relation to us again as a country, how God has blessed us with all that we have in this country. Let us not ever come to the place, and let this be a caution to us, a reminder, a caution to us, that our heart be lifted up in pride, that it would cause us to forget all the blessings of God. In verse 18 it says, "But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant with which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day." There's again, the caution was repeated there. Moses encouraged the people not to fall into the trap of forgetfulness. It was God who had empowered them to get the wealth so that they could establish, or he could establish, the word means confirm, his covenant which he sware unto their fathers. Their prosperity gave evidence that God was keeping his promises. Their prosperity in the land was just evidence to them that God is keeping his promises that he'd made. And let me say this too, that God has blessed us. God has hallowed out this land that we enjoy. And the prosperity that we enjoy in this country is simply, again, evidence that God keeps his promise to us as well, his children, his people. Then there's the last thing I want to look at quickly. We see a reminder of God's blessings in Canaan. We see the caution about forgetting God's blessings. But now notice the warning, a warning about the consequences of forgetting. Look at verse 19. "And it shall be, if thou do at all forget the Lord thy God, and walk after other gods, serve them and worship them," said in verse number 19, "I testify against you this day that ye shall surely perish." Verse 20 says, "As the nations which the Lord destroyed before your face, so shall ye perish, because you would not be obedient unto the voice of the Lord your God." Notice here the warning about the consequences of forgetting. Moses warned that forgetting the Lord would have consequences, dire consequences. For forgetting was simply the first link in a chain of sin. Now, this is what we need to understand, and what I believe we see in this country today, that Moses warned that forgetting the Lord would have dire consequences. For forgetting was the first link in a chain of sin. Notice, as it says there in verse 19, it says, "And it shall be, if thou do at all forget the Lord thy God," notice the links that continue, "and walk after other gods," not only walk after them, notice the next link, "serve them," notice the next link, worship them. And then he says the consequences, the dire consequences, I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish. But we find here that those who forget the Lord are not content to glorify themselves and take credit for divine achievements. It says there back in verse 17, and thou shalt say in thine heart, my power and the might of mine hand hath got me this wealth. We find again that those who forget the Lord are not content to glorify themselves and take credit for the divine achievements, that it's all because of God that we are what we are and have what we have. But pride and forgetting God leads to pride, and pride causes our heart to be lifted up, and we begin to say to ourselves in verse 17, thou say in thine heart, my power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me. I've gotten everything I have because I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps. No, that's pride. And that's an extension of forgetting God. And forgetting God is just the first link in the chain of sin. We find here that the next link in the chain of sin, that they would walk after other gods, they would serve them, they would worship them. And in verse 19, you see the steps there. Forgetting is the first step toward apostasy and idolatry. The first thing, they forget God, they overlook God, they don't really consider Him real, in everyday life. We find next that we find that is apostasy. They begin to walk after gods. They begin to follow other gods. They begin to serve other gods. They begin to worship other gods. And it just goes from forgetting to apostasy to idolatry. Think about our country today. Where are we at? Bibles are taken out of schools. Prayers taken out of schools. You can't discipline kids according to biblical mandates or principle. This nation has forgotten God. I don't have to stand here and tell you that. Just look at the news today and see what's going on in this world. This nation has forgotten its history. This nation has forgotten those who have sacrificed everything that we might have the freedoms we have. This nation has forgotten God. This nation is a nation of idolaters. This nation is walking after and serving other false gods. And we find that if God's people needed proof of the divine judgment against idolatrous nations and those who forsake the Lord, all they need to do was consider and remember, as it says in verse 20, the nations which the Lord destroyed before them. If they needed an example of that, all they had to do is look back and see what God had done in their behalf leading up to this point, but not only this point, but we find as they come into Canaan, and we find as Joshua begins to take over Moses' role, we know towards the end of the book of Joshua, in Joshua chapter 23, verse 3, it says, and ye have seen all that the Lord your God hath done unto all these nations because of you, for the Lord your God is he that hath fought for you. They would see not only in the past what God had done for them in destroying these idolatrous nations, but as they come into this land of Canaan, God explicitly told them to destroy the Canaanites, to destroy these wicked people in this land. But it was God who would be fighting for them. God would be doing the work. All these were to be solemn warnings to Israel there in verse 20. And one would think or expect that after receiving this and many other admonitions, that God's people would surely take care not to forget God. But we know they forgot God. I'm going to close with this. For hope for America? Yes. But America must not continue in its present course of forgetting God. I believe with all my heart, as we serve a living God, an all-powerful God, the creator of the universe, the world, and all that in them is, everything that's in the world. As long as we have and serve a living God, there's hope for America, but America must not continue its present course of forgetting God, lest we see exactly what God had told the children of Israel would happen. He says there in verse 19, I testify against you this day that ye shall surely perish. Verse 20, as the nations which the Lord destroyed before your face, so shall ye perish, because ye would not Be obedient unto the voice of the Lord your God. Let me say this. What did they forget? They forgot their deliverer. They forgot their supplier. They forgot their provider. And they forgot their defender. But as we know, their later history revealed to us and causes us to remember that they allowed him to be crowded out. The psalmist wrote in Psalm 9 verse 17, the wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. The wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. Is there hope for America? Yes. America, God shed his grace on thee and crowned thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. We cannot continue this course of forgetting God. We must get back to putting God first. Maybe all this is happening because of this reason, to bring us to a place to remind us of this reminder, this caution, and this warning here to the nation of Israel ought to be given to us, and we ought to take it to heart as well. Let's bow in prayer.